I should say not just happy Friday, but happy, crazy, your government is shutting down and turning out the lights Friday. Woohoo! The news just broke during Chris's show, as you heard last hour, that the UN Security Council has unanimously approved a resolution to relieve Syria of its chemical weapons under an international plan that will inspect the chemical weapons, secure them, and destroy them. Russia and China were among the countries voting unanimously for this resolution tonight on Syria's chemical weapons. This is a previously unimaginable diplomatic resolution to what had been seen for a very long time as an intractable problem. Syria didn't even admit they had chemical weapons until about 30 seconds ago. Now they are signed on to an international regime to get rid of them, and their closest allies in the world say they will make sure that it happens. Unimaginable. That coming on the same day, the same afternoon, as another diplomatic breakthrough of even greater proportions, possibly. The U.S. president speaking by telephone to the Iranian president tonight for the first time since 1979. We're going to have more on both of those stories coming up this hour. This is a very, very big news day. But the domestic news, of course, is dominated by our own Congress wantonly shutting down our own government for no externally imposed reason at all, just because one side has decided they maybe want to use this tactic to try to get what they want that they can't get through other, more normal diplomatic means. The White House today posted a list of how the many agencies of government plan to shut themselves down starting at midnight on Monday, handily because Republicans in Congress spent the last couple of years threatening to shut down the government to get what they wanted and that they couldn't get through other Democratic means. Agencies like, say, the Department of Agriculture, they were able to just go back and retrieve their old shutdown plans that they had prepared for the last time we had a brinksmanship contest like this in 2011. The National Park Service today said that they are making plans to kick out the campers, the overnight visitors to our national parks, because the shutdown means the national parks will be closing. Here's the Park Service plan for furloughing its employees, 21,000 American workers sent home. The Park Service plan is based in part on the planning that the agency did back in 2011, but also the agency's lived experience in the last big government shutdown, which was back in 1995. We have not had a big government shutdown since 1995. NPR today ran this great slideshow of what it looked like back then, including people being turned away from the Statue of Liberty, trying to visit the Statue of Liberty. No, I'm sorry, she's closed. The museum's closed. The Liberty Bell closed. That government shutdown in 1995 was the longest in our nation's history. And we are beginning to get a sense of what a shutdown would mean this time around. With 800,000 or so workers temporarily not working, crucial government functions, if not stopping altogether, then at least powering down to a very significant extent. The essential stuff, like air traffic control and sending out Social Security checks and so on, that stuff will get done. But defining what's essential isn't all that easy. In Colorado right now, they are, of course, cleaning up from devastating floods that killed 8 people and swept away homes and washed out hundreds of miles of roads. As part of its recovery, Colorado's been getting help from all over the place. For example, the Utah National Guard was planning to send 120 engineers to help rebuild a stretch of US 36 north of Boulder, Colorado. Colorado's been racing to rebuild its roads before the winter sets in, focusing on the most crucial arteries first. Well, now, as part of us all getting ready for a big government shutdown, more than half of the Utah National Guard engineers who'd been on their way to help in Colorado, they've been told to stand down. The Colorado National Guardsmen, already working on the recovery, are also now waiting to hear if they, too, are going to get pulled off the job and sent home in the middle of Colorado trying to recover from those floods, with the clock ticking to the first snows. We are starting to see what the shutdown would look like, what the cost of it will be, both in the states and in Washington, and what the knock-on effects might be in the economy at large. But there's another way of looking at this, about looking at why this is happening. One of the things we're not getting done in Washington, because we are having this self-imposed shutdown fight, is that we are not getting anything else done in Washington. And that, of course, is something that preceded this crisis, the whole thing about not getting anything done. Republicans in Congress have had a bunch of their own bills, for the kinds of bills that have to pass every year, not able to pass this year. These are their own bills, but they have not been able to pass them, even heading into this crisis, let alone now that we've got it. I mean, Republicans had a transportation and housing bill. They could not vote to pass their own transportation and housing bill. They had a bill to keep the government going, so we would not be facing this imminent shutdown. They could not vote to pass their own bill to keep the government going. They had a bill called the Farm Bill that's always used in jokes in Washington about what's the bare minimum thing you ought to be able to do even if you can do nothing else. This is supposed to be the easy one, the least controversial thing ever, right? And they wrote themselves one, but they could not get the votes to pass it, even their own bill, not even in their own caucus. Back during the run-up to the presidential election, you might remember a little kerfuffle about this bill because one of the candidates, Michelle Bachmann, was revealed to be a big corporate welfare recipient. Michelle Bachmann is always railing about the size of government and how government has to do less. But her family, it turned out, had taken over $250,000 in federal subsidies. Just a check from the government because they have a family farm. So it was this awkward sort of hypocrisy for Michelle Bachmann as a conservative presidential candidate that she was willing to take federal money through the Farm Bill as payment from the government for her family having a farm, but she simultaneously wanted to cut money from the same bill for other Americans who get money from that bill. Not because they have a farm, but because they have this problem. They need to eat. Cut food stamps for other people, keep farm subsidies for myself and my family. It's a particularly obnoxious form of political hypocrisy. And it's not just Michelle Bachmann. Even if you just look at members of Congress who are getting these kinds of subsidies for themselves, not even for their family members, just for themselves, there's a whole bunch of them. James Carter posted a spreadsheet today with a ton of information on this. We're going to link to it at maddowblog.com tonight. But just looking at the ones who get these subsidies for themselves, look at Congressman Tom Latham of Iowa. Mr. Latham used to be the co-owner of the Latham Seed Company and a couple of farms that had his name on them. So back home, he was taking farm subsidies by the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of dollars from the federal government. But in D.C., in Congress, Mr. Latham voted to cut food subsidies from the same bill for people who need to eat. Martha Roby, Congresswoman from Alabama. She owns a farm in Montgomery County, Alabama. Back home, Ms. Roby has been getting checks from the federal government for her farm. Thank you very much. But in Congress, she voted to keep the farm aid going to herself, but to cut the money for people who need help getting something to eat. Same bill. Wants specifically to keep the money that goes to her, but to cut the money that goes to anybody else in the same bill. Call me a liberal. You do anyway. But how can you vote that your family should be able to continue to be given federal money through this specific bill, but you cannot abide other Americans, poor Americans, getting money from the same bill so they can eat? How can you take it for yourself and move to block it for somebody else? Apparently, it is not that hard to do something like that because we see it over and over and over again. And it's part of what's going on right now in Washington. I mean, hypocrisy is obviously not a new phenomenon in Washington. Washington didn't even invent it. But we've seen some pretty acute cases of it in the last few years. At the very beginning of the Obama administration, for example, we saw it when every single House Republican voted against the stimulus bill. Remember the stimulus bill? But then they went home to their home districts and started appearing at ribbon-cutting events with big cardboard checks to take credit for all that funding, all the new jobs that were being created as a result of the stimulus, which they voted against. Credit me for this thing, local residents, this thing that I tried to stop happening. I want credit for this thing that I tried to block. At the end of last year, when Hurricane Sandy absolutely ravaged the Northeast, when it left parts of New Jersey and New York almost unrecognizable, when it hit the most densely populated region in the nation, it left thousands of families homeless with no place to go. The governors of the states that were hardest hit asked the federal government for help, and they were told no by a sort of shocking number of members of Congress. In the Senate, it was 36 Senate Republicans who voted against relief after Hurricane Sandy. That's 77% of Senate Republicans who opposed hurricane relief for Sandy. In the House, it was about the same. It was 78% of Republicans in the House who told Sandy victims, nope, the federal government would not and should not help you. Among those House Republicans saying no were all 4 Republicans from the House delegation from Colorado. They all voted no on Sandy relief. This month, though, when floodwaters absolutely devastated the state of Colorado, those same 4 House Republicans who voted no on disaster relief for families in New York and New Jersey publicly called on the federal government to help themselves, to help their state. Federal disaster relief for Sandy victims? They don't deserve it. Federal government isn't in that kind of business. But hey, me over here, we need that. Republican Congressman Bill Flores of Texas, Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, they both voted against federal aid for Sandy victims. 3 months later, when a fertilizer plant explosion leveled the town of West Texas, those same two Texans asked for federal aid for victims in their own state. Republican Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma voted to block federal aid for victims of Hurricane Sandy. And then when tornadoes ripped through the city of Moore, Oklahoma, just a few months later, Senator Inhofe asked for that relief aid for residents in his own state. He said it was, quote, totally different from him trying to block relief for Hurricane Sandy victims. It takes a particularly galling sort of hypocrisy to think that way and talk that way, and more importantly, to vote that way in Congress when you are sent there to work for the good of the people. What you do in Congress may seem like it's theory or it's ideological expression or it's just something that people get to talk about on cable news and then you clip up little pieces of cable news and turn it into attack ads. But your actions have consequences when you are a member of Congress. And hypocrisy, in its miserable, cold little heart, is a lack of empathy. We think of it as saying one thing and doing the opposite. But it comes from a lack of feeling for anyone who is not you yourself. It comes from voting to make other people go hungry while you quietly cash your government check from the same program. It means voting down disaster relief for anybody else right before you insist that the federal government open the taps and send the disaster relief dollars to you. Because you can't imagine the problems that other people are having, but the problems that you're having, those you feel. It means throwing the country into economic, governmental, everyday living chaos because you didn't get your way. And because you do not care how it affects ordinary Americans or America until it affects you. This shutdown is going to hurt the country. It's already hurting the country. That was the message today from President Obama, who spoke today on short notice with palpable frustration.
To any Republican in Congress who's currently watching, I'd encourage you to think about who you're hurting. There are probably young people in your office right now who came to work for you without much pay because they believed that public service was noble. You're preparing to send them home without a paycheck. You've got families with kids back in your districts who serve their country in the federal government. And now they might have to plan how they're going to get by if you shut the government down. Past shutdowns have disrupted the economy, and this shutdown would as well. It would throw a wrench into the gears of our economy at a time when those gears have gained some traction. And that's why many Republican senators and many Republican governors have urged Republicans to knock it off, pass a budget, and move on. Let's get this done.
Joining us now is Ezra Klein, MSNBC policy analyst and the Wonk blog editor for The Washington Post. Ezra, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Been thinking today, trying to think today less about the marginal political developments of the moment and more about what this is hard, right? Because that's what we're all focused on, trying to figure out if this is going to happen. But I'm trying to get focused on the stakes here, the cost. Can you talk a little bit about what we know the economic impact or the nuts and bolts impact would be of a shutdown, and it would be a government shutdown first, and then next, conceivably, of a default?
Right. So a government shutdown is a bad thing. You do not want to have it happen. In direct economic costs, the Office of Management and Budget actually tried to look at the cost of the 95 and 96 shutdowns, which were the two longest we've ever had. They calculated it at about $2 billion. That's not great. You don't want to pay $2 billion for no reason. And, of course, during that time, you had a lot of pain from the families involved. But it is not an incredibly large impact on an economy the size of our own. It's just bad. A default is an economic storm of literally, and I mean literally, unimaginable proportions, because we've never allowed it to happen. We've never even conceived of allowing it to happen ever before. And the difference is this. Actually, the president put it well today. He said, a shutdown is shutting down the government. A default is shutting down the economy. And the analogy I try to get people to think of is 2008, right? Because we've just been through a financial crisis. And at its heart, what happened there was you had these things called subprime bonds, right? You had subprime securities. That was the housing market. And Wall Street thought they were worth one thing. They thought housing market was safe. Turned out they were wrong and it was worth another. And that uncertainty, not knowing what it was all worth, it froze Wall Street, it destroyed the global economy. Now, subprime bonds were a significant part of Wall Street. They are nothing like U.S. Treasuries. They are nothing like our cornerstone asset, which is the fundamental building block of the global financial system. If we go to the world and we say we are not riskless, we are not worth what you thought we were worth, you have to reprice all of that. We have no idea what it looks like the next day when the markets wake up and say, we don't know at all what anything we have is worth. That is another financial crisis, and it has a potential to be much bigger than the one we had in 2008 if we kept it going for any length of time.
Ezra, you wrote today something that on Wonk Blog, it's something that I think provoked a lot of people because on the surface it seemed so scary, but I want to hear you make the argument. And you said essentially that you were rooting for the shutdown, meaning the government shutdown, in the hopes, I'm going to paraphrase, that would mean the Republicans got their yayas out. Mm-hmm. And whatever was in them that was desiring to cause some form of chaos, to dramatize their internal feelings, right, that would be essentially exhausted by the government shutdown fight. And while that would be bad, maybe then we wouldn't have the default. Politically, do you think that's true? Does the Yaya's hypothesis have data to back it up, or are you just hoping?
So I'll say I am rooting for Congress to do the smart thing and not do any of this, right? That is my first best. It is being said in the Republican caucus and in the Democratic caucus that the way the Republicans are thinking about this is that if they are forced by John Boehner, and they will see it as being forced, to give up their what they would call leverage on the government shutdown, to accept a clean bill to fund the government on Sunday or Monday or whenever they do it, that they will feel that they gave up that point of leverage. And what they traded that in for was the much larger point of leverage of the default. And the reason, by the way, they think the default has more leverage is because it would be such an unimaginable, terrible thing for the economy. So if they
pushing
do that,
us off a skyscraper instead of pushing us off a house.
Yeah,
right, okay.
Trading in the flu for septic shock is the way I like to put it. And so right now, the issue is John Boehner is saying to them, don't do this on the government shutdown. Let's just wait till the debt ceiling. And so he is making it, he is investing them more in the debt ceiling, because once they've gone through the shutdown, if they've not used that, they've got nothing but the debt ceiling in their minds. So what Politico has reported, what Goldman Sachs has been saying, what I'm hearing from my sources on the Hill as well, is that it is going to be harder to get Republicans past a debt ceiling if they don't do the shutdown. In my view, and in the view of some others, it would be easier to have a shutdown that has some damage to the economy but modest. We've had a lot of these before, I should say.
But alleviate some of the pressure.
It gives them a high drama place to have this fight, and then when they see the polls turn against them in 5 days and 10 days, we can get this done before we hit the debt ceiling on October 17th.
Oh, God. This is the most unnerving thing, you know? It's a very unnerving process, and trying to trade these ills against one another at this point means we are too close to the edge already. Ezra Klein, columnist for the Washington Post Wonk blog, a guy who I think actually quite owned the whole narrative and the discussion about this today. I think you really framed the way that everybody's been thinking about it today in a way that you ought to be proud of. Thanks. All right. So many unprecedented and, in fact, wildly unpredictable things transpired this week between the United States and the rest of the world. But what happened today with a phone call that President Obama made that nobody knew was coming topped it all. And that story is next.